The rise of AA games. I've never really delved into the topic of AA games, and like I've never really like kind of heard of AA games. I mean, I've heard of AA games, and I've never really like kind of heard them as much as AAA, obviously, right? So I don't know really a lot of AA games, but
is widely accepted to be one of the greatest years for gaming, well, ever. The industry is in a bit of a sore spot right now.
2023 was.
More than 8,000 gaming professionals being laid off in 2024 alone. Now this has sparked much discussion about both the uneasy state of AAA gaming and the popularity of AA titles in recent times. How lower budget, smaller scale games seem to be enjoying massive success, while so many blockbusters are struggling to post the sales they need. Now it's a bit of a complex situation with a lot to chew over, but you know what? By taking a step back, we can make sense of why AA is thriving right now, why AAA is in desperate need of reform, and what the future of the industry holds for both of them. So let's have a chat. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com.
I think AA games will get a lot of hype, which also could be a downscale, right? It could negatively affect the game as a whole. AA games don't get as much attention, which could then lead for them to focus more on their game other than the audience, right? And being a AAA game. I think sometimes that happens a lot.
Of AA games. So let's start with the obvious fact that they are so much cheaper than AAA games. In a time of global belt tightening, it really shouldn't be terribly surprising that AA games are flourishing, because when the cost of living is so high, shelling out 60 quid for a brand new AAA game isn't an appealing or even feasible proposition for many. But AA titles are generally priced considerably lower. I mean, take the recent Helldivers 2, which hit the market at around 35 quid, which is almost half of what a typical AAA title costs. And even accepting that Helldivers 2 is a uniquely polished breakout hit, it's simply a far less intimidating sell for cash-strapped players than the higher price tags of AAA fare. When AA developers price their titles so reasonably with no detriment to their overall quality, of course budget-conscious players are going to flock to them in droves. We've all been burned by purchasing day one AAA games at a high cost only for them to be pure dud. I mean, I'm looking at you, Driver 3, I've not forgotten. And so AA lowers price of entry means that you're far less likely to feel bad about spending, even if a game doesn't fully meet your expectations. And speaking of expectations, you're about to have yours blown away by the sheer amount of diversity that
I think expectation comes from obviously whatever, not what the game may look like, right? I don't expect, the new Star Wars game to be a very polished game and everything. Like I said, the story trailer looked very polished and very like all right. But then once you look at reviews or positive and negative reviews, I think there's a large majority of difference. So then that's where a lot of the expectations come from, right? You don't expect the game to be bad or good based on the trailer. I mean, you kind of do, but you expect it on what people think it's gonna, what the people think is how it's gonna do, right? And then you take that and then you form it into your own opinion, and you're like, oh yeah, this game, I expect this game to do good because the reviews are good, right? You don't normally say expect it to be good because the trailer is good, right? I mean, there's trailers out there that aren't really good, and then the game is good, right? So I mean,
AAA games offer, because with
there's a
few
lot of different
exceptions,
factors.
AAA games tend to cling to the most firmly established of genres, because when a publisher is spending potentially over $100 million on a new blockbuster title, why would they stray from the safety of cinematic action games, open world RPGs, online shooters, and so on? But with AA games being produced at a lower, less risky price point, developers are emboldened to dabble in less commercial genres, like quirky platformers, narrative-driven adventures, and experimental puzzle games. The AAA business model typically isn't compatible with left-field thinking, because when you're asking players to fork out top dollar for a new release, why risk alienating them with weird characters and oddball gameplay mechanics? But the AA is conversely a fertile ground for exactly this. You're never going to see games like Psychonauts or The Witness with tentpole budgets, but by accepting a lower tier of production, developers are able to deliver unique experiences with considerably less financial pressure. If it's a common argument that the AAA sphere feels too safe samey nowadays, dominated primarily by flashy yet shallow fare, AA is where developers get to be unrestrained artists in the truest sense. And you know what?
Yeah.
It doesn't take them that long to develop either. Because one of the biggest...
Yeah, well, because obviously AA games aren't going to develop, you know what I mean? Because if they were, they would obviously, I mean, they wouldn't obviously be, but I mean, yeah, it's common sense that AA games don't take as long as AAA games, right? That's common sense. But I think that AA games tend to do a little bit better than AAA games because of the factor that they don't have all the weight of being a AAA game on their shoulders, right? They don't have much community feedback. They might have a lot of community feedback, but it's not as much as the AAA games to hold them down, right? So they have all that time and they have the non-restraints to do whatever they want. They don't have the community suggestions to do what they want. They obviously will still listen to community suggestions, but not as much. And that's why those tend to do a little bit better, because I feel like if you listen to a large majority of people that want the game to be this, there's still that majority of people that aren't going to want it, right? Now there's mixed reviews or 70-30, but with less majority less reviews that want something different, there comes the base game that doesn't change, which then attracts the same audience. Then you have a 90-10% player base that 90% love the game and know what the game is, and that game will always stay the same, right? Like Stray. And then there's the game that will change over time and then will lose and gain population of players based on what they're doing because of the community, right? And I think that has a large impact on the game itself.
Biggest hurdles facing the AAA realm right now is the sheer length of time it takes to produce even a single blockbuster game, which is now easily upwards of a 5-year stretch. Due to the higher graphical fidelity and greater complexity of modern AAA games, they require enormous amounts of manpower and money to bring them across the finish line, often leaving players frustrated that they've had to wait so many years between sequels. But the AA production pipeline is simply better equipped to ensure a steady stream of franchise releases without developers toiling for half a decade or longer on each individual game. I mean, take A Plague Tale Requiem, which released roughly 3 years after the original game, or Yakuza or Like a Dragon, which keeps up a mind-boggling release clip by reusing environmental assets that frees up development resources for story and gameplay enhancements. While some AA games, of course, do have lengthy gaps between releases, this isn't usually because of the developer having to spend an entire interim period crunching away. Simply put, if a AA game performs well, there's a strong chance you won't be left waiting an agonizing amount of time for a follow-up or to have some much-needed additional content. In an era where the AAA model is often deemed unsustainable, it seems like a much healthier and yes, sustainable way to produce games using the AA method. And of these games that we get, so many of them are just straight to the point. They don't have that AAA bloat. I mean, just think.
That's what I'm talking about, right? They're straight to the point of what their game wants to be, right? And there isn't much changes, and there isn't much updates as much as there would to a AAA game, and that's just facts, right? And it varies across games, but it's more tended to see, or it's more likely to be seen in AA games that there is less changes being made, which means they had to attract a stronger audience of what the base game will be.
How many games have you played recently that have fallen under the AAA sphere that have just had you doing the same busy work again and again and again, or live service models that treat your time like it's to be wasted, like it turns your free time into a goddamn second job? Thankfully though, the AA feels no such burden, and while of course there are AA collectathon grindfests out there, developers are evidently far more comfortable delivering a shorter, more concise end product when they're putting up a lower price tag. Even otherwise great AAA games can end up feeling like time sinks. I mean, many felt that both Final Fantasy VII Remake and The Last of Us Part 2 outstayed their welcomes in the pursuit of conveying value, where AA fare just gave you value for money and didn't treat your time like a resource it was willing to waste. And speaking of that consideration of the player, there's just better community engagement in the AA sphere. Now, an aspect of AAA development that isn't really discussed much is how difficult it becomes for the human aspect of their creation to permeate through. The average AAA game is such a gargantuan beast, usually produced at the behest of a large company, that the voices of the people spearheading the project can easily get lost in the shuffle. This This
Yeah.
is most noticeable when something goes wrong and a publisher bigwig or community manager makes a tone-deaf statement because they're just simply too detached from the process of game making and the people playing said game.
Overwatch.
AA development is generally less likely to nudge the creatives to the periphery in favor of cold PR spokespeople. And so it's easier to feel
Yeah,
like
I
these
mean, I
games
agree
aren't
in
so
that.
much uncaring corporate products as actual pieces of art crafted with a human hand from start to finish. I mean, just look at what's going on with Helldivers 2 right now.
Yeah,
The
this is
team are
amazing.
responding to nearly every bit of feedback that they get. They're active on social media. They are making their product feel
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm saying by there isn't there isn't much updates based on what the community is saying. I think sometimes they do too much to the point where they attract an audience that want a base game, but then the base game gets deleted after 3-4 months because of a change. Not the base game, but those little updates and those little things that make the game will get changed, and those people that love the game, which is a majority of the player base a lot of the times, will not like the game and will put negative reviews in, or they'll stop playing. And you can see this from like a lot of games like Fortnite, right? Though those games have changed a lot over the years and definitely decreased in players, right? Not maybe in popularity, but decreased in players because a lot of players are like, oh, this is becoming very, very weird. This becomes very, very transaction-y, right? And they just want money. They're not really listening to us. But the games like Helldivers that listen to the community and do what the community want, not to the point where they're changing so much of the base game, but they're updating what the people actually want, then that's where a game pops off and becomes a good game. Even if it's a AA or AAA or whatever game, right? If that happens, the majority of players that have already stuck with the game will continue to stick with the game because they get what they want. And I mean, that's just how it is, right?
is alive with passion, and that is something that the AAA really struggles with. So going back to finances for a moment, let's talk about how AA games are perfect for the likes of Game Pass or PS Plus. Because one of the most tectonic shifts in the gaming industry over the last few years has been the surging popularity of subscription services, spearheaded by Microsoft's excellent Xbox Game Pass service and, to a lesser extent but still pretty good, PlayStation Plus. Now, there's been much hand-wringing in recent times about the commercial viability of Microsoft releasing first-party AAA games day and date on this service, something that Sony hasn't and probably ever won't do with PS Plus. Now, famously, Microsoft even estimated that they'd have to spend $300 million to get Star Wars Jedi Survivor on Game Pass at launch, which evidently proved to be totally cost prohibitive as it never happened. But profit scrutiny aside, Game Pass is an absolute haven for AA games, an incredible repository for smaller scale and more modest and quirkier experiences like, say, Hi-Fi Rush, Pentiment, and Wulong Fallen Dynasty, to name just a few. Countless developers over the years have cited Game Pass as a hugely beneficial thing for their business, because in addition to Microsoft paying for the game's inclusion on their service, it will also lead to some players buying their game outright or additionally purchasing DLC that they otherwise wouldn't have. And for gamers, these typically shorter, more contained titles feel perfect for a monthly subscription, namely that they can actually be comfortably beaten within a month. Game Pass and PS Plus
I
are
agree on that.
fantastic services for budget-minded gamers and ensure that subscribers are exposed to far more AA content than they would have been elsewhere. And with so much variety on offer, you can't help but look as the AAA becoming stale. I mean, there's a strong argument to be made that AAA gaming has never felt more stale than it does right now, where rising costs incentivize publishers to be as risk-averse as possible
I don't know about
greenlighting
that.
tentpole projects. This results in cynical slop like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and on even the higher end of the quality spectrum, much of
That's a
Sony's
little
AAA
different, yeah.
output does
Agree.
kind of
That-
feel
that-
like
that
it's
one's not
operating within
good.
a familiar, stylishly cinematic, yet ultimately uninventive wheelhouse. Even most of the great games released this generation haven't felt like they've offered much innovation in terms of either gameplay or aesthetics, in turn encouraging players starved of more adventurous out-there titles to turn towards the AA and indie games. With so many feeling AAA fatigue these days, it makes sense that so many AA releases are thriving, because you're often ending up with more artistically daring products for much less money. And they are far more accessible. The AAA label is generally accepted to indicate certain levels of production value, that no matter the quality of the game otherwise, it should be at least a visually impressive experience, and more often than not, that is true. AA, meanwhile, invites more modest expectations for how a game will look, often prompting developers to focus less on fastidious photorealism in favor of more distinctive, eye-catching art styles. Again, we bring up Hi-Fi Rush as a good example of this, and to be honest, this is a good example of what Scott and I
Rush
always
isn't
talk
bad,
about
yeah.
here on the channel, of good graphics paling in comparison to good art
Cyberpunk's
direction.
very
There is a
good.
reason why Okami will
Yeah, they
forever
need to
live
update
on
it.
as being a beautifully drawn game, not just for the smart choice of having cel-shaded graphics that do not age, but also just because it has a fantastic art style. The art direction was good. And because these AA games aren't so intensive on your console or hardware, it means that they can run on pretty much anything. The majority of AA games will run on your trusty Steam Deck, but AAA though, that's kind of a crapshoot, where exuberant production can leave many willing customers unable to play, whether through bugs
Yeah,
or
I think
glitches on console.
I
or
think
just
AAA also require. I mean, AAA are bigger games, right? So they require a little bit more PC power to run and all that. And a lot of these games require a lot of stuff to run, right? And you can say that by just looking at the requirements and everything, and not much of them, not a lot of games that require good PCs, but a lot of them will say, oh, you only need this to require, but then I mean, no, right? Your RAM will stack out of the wazoo, right? Your game frequently crashes, it frequently lags, and then boom, you can't play the AAA game that you always wanted to play, right? But I think that comes in with a lot of other games, especially with AAA, which is a big thing. But I'm not saying because of that, don't buy it or whatever, or don't do this or don't do that, or AAA is bad and you should buy AA games, right? But I think sometimes it's a factor that will drive people out of AAA games.
Lack of optimization on PC. If AAA is only for console owners and those with high-end PCs, AA is basically for everyone. It caters to large swathes of the gaming.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It should cater, like he said, to a higher majority of the people playing. Sorry. People playing PC or console or Xbox that don't have good platforms to play on, or don't have a good PC or a good Xbox or a good PS to play on, right? So there's a higher majority of people to play on those AA games and AAA, right? That only makes sense.
Market, and is yet another reason why AA is enjoying fruitful success while AAA is struggling. And you know what? Because of the good art direction, because of the fact that they've gone in with the gameplay first, front and center, many AA games feel AAA anyway. Because though the intricacies of game developments are tough for outsiders to quantify, it's fair to say that many AA games have managed to punch far above their weight, enough so to basically resemble AAA caliber products. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, for instance, is so polished, stylistic and cinematic that it feels like little would be gained by injecting it with a AAA budget, save perhaps for Ninja Theory bloating out the game's playtime. The same is basically true of the Plague Tale games. And more recently, nobody's coming away from Helldivers 2 feeling like it's anything less than an extremely well-crafted and labored over project. Smart designers are able to make the most of their AA resources in order to deliver an experience which can at least get close to what we see in the AAA arena. Also, much of AAA development feels like it's straining to justify those massive upfront costs. And even when disparity between AA and AAA is totally noticeable, it often feels less like a chasm and more like a stepping stone between them, something that is rarely reflected in the huge price difference. And finally, the most important point of all, AA can help modest single-player experiences survive. Single-player games at the AAA level are in something of a perilous spot right now. I mean, we all remember the outrage over the Order 1886 lasting a mere 5 hours despite Sony expecting players to fork out a full-fat AAA price tag. And so, single-player AAA games have typically become increasingly bloated out with things to do. Excessive cinematic spectacle with tacked-on multiplayer, live service nonsense, or just grotesque microtransaction integration, or just all of these. Now, it's all in the pursuit of risk and cost mitigation to ensure the publisher's exposure is as small as possible when sending a mega-budget AAA behemoth out into the world. But for those who miss the days where 10-hour single-player games dominated the industry, AA has become their new home. Few are going to turn their nose up at a 30-quid game that can be beaten in under a dozen hours, and so this is the venue where the straight-laced single-player game can thrive. Consider this: what if the Callisto Protocol scaled back its admittedly first-rate visuals and went the AA route instead? Well, many would have been decidedly less miffed about its mere 8-hour length, and given the popularity of AA horror, it probably would have been a solid success. And that is just one example. Think of how many other games would have just done better if they'd spent less and said more. And there we go, my friends. That was the rise of AA games. I hope you enjoyed this little chat here.
I did. I think if a lot of games, you know, went for the AA route, right? I think they'd be a little bit more successful, because if they, you know, maybe pumped down the graphics a little bit, made the game longer. A lot of games make the graphics really good, make everything good, the quality of the game good, but then the actual inner quality, right? The story, the length is short, right? It can sometimes be bad, right? So if they make a mediocre looking game, and then make a good storyline, focus on the storyline, focus on the length of the game, I think a lot of games will be more successful if they focus on the pure good looking quality of the game, right? The performance of the game. Obviously the performance should be good. So I mean, hey, that's my take on this. If you guys enjoyed, leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. See ya.